In this video, we're going to talk about what happens when you list your house over the market value, the pros that come with it, and also the cons that come along with it. So let's start with the pros first, because everyone wants to talk about the good stuff. Well, it sells, and we're all happy, and the story ends from there. Not necessarily. We'll go over that in a little bit of what could happen. So the pros is it sells, and if you have the right buyer with motivation, and it sells, and the storybook is over. But depending on your motivation too, if say, we want to list this puppy, but if it sells, it sells. If it doesn't, it doesn't, and that's okay. Well, then if the seller, you have motivation on that side, well, then you can be super selective with which buyer goes ahead and takes up this property. And another pro with listing over market value is you can always come down. Like, I'm gonna start at 300, and if it, we start up high, and we can always come down to 280. And depending on our motivation, we could be okay with that or not okay, depending on your motivation. Okay? So one of the pros that I talked about first was, it sells and we have a smiley face, real happy, but there's also a con that comes along with that, and I'll get to that in a bit. So one of the first cons with listing over market value is time on the market. So you can expect, maybe a higher time on the market, depending on your area. And maybe instead of, 30 days where you get something under contract, maybe that goes up to 60 days and 90 days, depending on, are you okay with that? Did we go back to your motivation? Are you okay with having that time on the market? But also, not necessarily just the seller's motivation, maybe the buyer sees that and it's like, this puppy's been on the market for 90 days. Is there something up with this thing? Like, what's going on here? That's something a buyer's gonna be thinking about. Another con is once you do decide to reduce the price, if you do that, is you're gonna see posts of the price improvement, price reduction. So people are gonna see that and associate with, a discount or what's going on here. When there's a price cut, something's up. So that's one thing to consider with the con is your price reduction posts on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and all that sorts of stuff. So this is what I was talking about, where we're gonna go back to the pros is your property sells, everyone's happy, let's go. But however, there's one caveat, depending on which type of buyer you have, this could throw everything in a whammy, and that's the appraisal. So let's just say, we get this thing sold at 300,000 and the appraisal comes in at 280. And that throws a wrench into everything. And going back to our motivation here, are we okay with coming down in price? Are we not? Are we okay with, hey, if we're the seller situation, what, Mr. Buyer, if you're not gonna close that gap on $20,000, you can go ahead and walk away, because our motivation really isn't the highest. Going back to what we said earlier, if it sells, it sells. If it doesn't, it doesn't. We're okay with that. So that motivation on listing over market values is a huge thing, because this thing right here, the appraisal, can throw a wrench into everything. And maybe, like I said earlier, you're okay with finding a new buyer that has the cash, and you could be selective on that buyer that has that funds to, if the appraisal comes in low, that they can go ahead and fill that gap, that $20,000 gap, if in the situation we're at 300,000 and the appraisal comes in at 280. So that's one thing. And like I said here, again, specific buyer. So a con with listing over market values, you have to find a specific buyer potentially to fill in that gap if an appraisal comes in low. So that's one scenario. Another con is potentially limited showings. So maybe you're overpriced and you're just not getting as much traction on your property, not getting as much showings, and with limited showings means limited offers, so you have to be really picky or not just having many options to choose from to begin with. So that's a con, is potentially limited showings. And another thing too is seller credits. Like, hey, we finally got someone to put in an offer at 300 in this scenario, but they're asking for a lot of concessions, so it doesn't really matter anyways. They're asking to max out the closing costs for our buyer to help out on that way. So it's like, we are at the 300, but what are we really netting? So you might be, enticing. Maybe that even happens in the future. Like, hey, you have it on the MLS, like, we want to give concessions, we're willing to do that. Now our motivation's starting to flip the other way, like, oh, okay, we gotta get this puppy sold, but we don't want to do the price reduction, but we will have credits. So there's different ways to go about that. And hopefully in this video you learned some stuff about listing over the market value, the pros, it sells, caveat, appraisal, and that's just one wrench. And yeah, hopefully you learned something. And if you want me to talk more in detail about maybe time on market, price reduction, posts, anything, leave a comment. I'll go ahead and do that. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Bye.